So thank you very much, Jean-Paul, for having me here and for organizing this fascinating conference. So this paper is joint with Jean Tirole, and basically it's a paper between theory, history, and empirics, or empirical economics. So of course it's a short presentation, so I'll try to give you a glimpse of each. But I'll focus more on the history and the empirical sides, okay? But I'll give you some theory as well. Okay, so the main motivation for this paper is the idea about hostility towards what we call unwanted populations. So that might be relevant to the previous presentation. So this hostility, or the definition of the unwanted population, could be based on their identity, their religious identity, racial identity, and so on. What we're interested in here is that this hostility would, in many cases, expose rulers or the dominant group, the group that has the political power, to a certain dilemma. Basically, they are, on the one hand, wanting to extract the willingness to pay to remain a member of the unwanted population. But on the other hand, they are afraid of running the risk of losing the contribution of the unwanted population through conversion, through migration, and so on. So there are many examples in history of this trade-off. The lead example in this paper is the poll tax that was paid by members of certain religious communities. But you can think of many other examples. For example, you can think of dissonant colleagues whose departure would be costly. So if you want to push certain policies in the department and there is an opposition group, for example, in the department, then you, you are running the risk of losing these people, but at the same time you want to have them around. But you are running the risk of not being able to push your policy forward. There is also a wealth tax in Turkey in 1942 that was, in principle, it was an untargeted tax, so it was imposed on everyone, but in practice it targeted non-Muslim minorities. And so they wanted to impose a wealth tax, so they wanted to extract money, but at the same time they ran the risk of exodus, so that many non-Muslim minorities left the country. So let me move on to the lead example in our paper, which is the fiscal policy in early Islam. So there will be a lot of historical details here, because I guess many of you may not be familiar with the narrative. So first of all, let's think of the Islamization of what we call now the Middle East: Egypt, Greater Syria, and Iraq. Just to fix ideas, following Muhammad's death in 632, the Arabs conquered the southern part of the Byzantine Empire and the eastern part as well. And they also conquered the Persian Empire. On the eve of the Arab conquests, local populations of these regions of Egypt, Greater Syria, and Iraq, of course, were by definition non-Muslims, right? This is a forgotten fact. And these non-Muslims were, in Egypt, they were called Coptic Christians. The vast majority were Coptic Christians. There were Jacobites in Greater Syria, Nestorians in Iraq. But of course, there were also other Christian factions who did not belong to these groups, and there was a Jewish population as well in each of these countries. What we know is that non-Muslims shrank from 100% at the time of the conquest to 7% in 1897. So we're talking about 1,300 years later. For Greater Syria and Iraq, we know a bit, we have a data point before that, which comes from the Ottoman tax registers. So we know that they became 9% and 5% in Greater Syria and Iraq, respectively, which means that Islamization happened really before the Ottomans, right? What we also know is that Islamization was mostly driven by voluntary conversions to Islam rather than by coercion. So there were definitely episodes of coercive conversion, which you could think of as conversion under the threat of death. But these were rare incidents. These were not the main driver. You can also think of demographic causes like population replacement, which essentially means that the Arabs from the Arab Peninsula replaced the populations of these countries. But this is, of course, is not the main driver, simply because the whole population of the Arab Peninsula was very small. Right? These countries, if we talk about Iraq, Greater Syria, and Egypt, these were really the big masses, right, in the region. So there was no, of course, Arabs migrated to these areas, but this is not the main driver of the Islamization. Fertility differences, cross-religion marriages, I don't have time to discuss this, but we don't have evidence that, if anything, actually non-Muslims had higher fertility than Muslims. So it's not that, that this was driver of conversion. One important fact to bear in mind is that being Muslim was an absorbing state, meaning that once you convert to Islam, you become non-Muslim forever, and all your dynasty, all your offspring is non-Muslim. Once you become Muslim, all your offspring becomes Muslim, right? Which essentially comes from three Islamic laws. First, that the son of, or the offspring of a Muslim father is automatically Muslim, so it's automatically inherited. Second, that apostates are sentenced to death. So once you convert to Islam, you cannot convert back. And third, that Muslim females may only marry Muslim males, right? So these three laws together ensured that being Muslim was an absorbing state. So there is a choice only one way in the first generation, right? Let's now move on to the Islamic taxation in the early Arab Caliphate. So from 632 until 750, the Arab Caliphate imposed what we call a discriminatory tax on the local non-Muslim populations. Of course, in the beginning, this was a tax on everyone, right? This is a tax on all the population, which is by definition non-Muslim. But the key thing in this tax is that conversion to Islam exempted a taxpayer from this tax. So in that sense, it was a discriminatory tax. There were two components of this tax. The first one, which is relatively more known, is the poll tax. In Arabic, it's called jizya, which is a per head cash tax on adult-free males. The second component was difference in land tax rates. So essentially, non-Muslim landholders paid a tax called Karash tax, which was higher than the Ushr or the Zakat tax that was paid by Muslim landholders. So if you add up the two pieces, the poll tax plus this difference, you get a discriminatory tax. Two things to have in mind is that the Ushr tax, which you could think of theoretically as a uniform tax that is paid by everyone, right? And then the non-Muslim landholders pay on top of that the difference between Kharaj and Ushr. This Ushr tax may have not been enforced by the state. So in this period, we have evidence, or we actually lack any evidence on actual tax payments of Ushr tax. Second important thing to have in mind is that the Ushr tax had an upper bound in hadith or in prophet sayings, but the Karash tax was either decided by a treaty with the local population. In such case, it had an upper bound, which is mentioned in the treaty, or it was decided by Caliph's will in case there is no treaty, so it's just pure military conquest, and in that case, there is no upper bound.
You mean upper bound in total amount or in rate?
In rate. So let me come back to the initial motivation, which is this trade-off between, in our case, it will be conversions and tax revenues. So extracting the unwanted population willingness to pay to remain non-Muslim, and at the same time, you want to convert people to Islam. So we have this very famous quote by Omar II, who was the Caliph of the Arab Umayyad Empire. And he's saying that Muhammad was sent as a prophet and not as a tax collector. So this was a very pious caliph who was essentially pushing for conversions rather than increasing tax revenues. So this tension was in people's minds at that time. Then this is a long quote, I'm not gonna read it all, by a very well-known papyrologist and historian. And you can see in the last part that she's saying that basically there was a tension between ensuring a continuous source of fiscal income while simultaneously serving the Muslim mission to win converts. So, did this tension lead to a real reduction or a real decline in tax revenues? The answer is, from what we know in historical narratives, yes. So what happened is that the discriminatory tax revenues fell in the very early period, although the tax rate remained constant. So what this suggests is that the tax base itself was shrinking due to conversions. So how did the Caliphate respond? It responded through implementing various tax reforms. In the early period, it tried to abolish customary tax exemptions that were inherited from the Byzantine and the Persian administrations. For example, they imposed the poll tax on monks, local elites, and fugitives. They imposed the higher Karash tax on churches and monasteries. In the very beginning, Arabs, who were different from the converts, the local populations, were not paying the Ushr. Then they imposed the Ushr on Arabs. And in a certain case, even they tried to impose the poll and Karash taxes on converts. But the important thing is that starting from 750, which is the key date in Islamic taxation, the canonical Islamic tax system was established. And under this system, the land tax on Muslims was raised from the Ushr tax to the Karash tax, right? So from that date onwards, the discriminatory tax became equal to the poll tax, remember? And they essentially abolished this difference by increasing land tax on Muslims. And then what's interesting is that jurists invented a new historical narrative that denied the existence of peace treaties, and they removed any upper bound on Karash. So they said, okay, now land tax is imposed on everyone, not only on non-Muslims, and it has no upper bound. And this new Islamic tax system was enforced from 750 until the 19th century, when the poll tax was finally abolished. So this is a long historical introduction, but let me now jump to the research question and what we do. So in an earlier paper using evidence from Egypt, I documented that because the poll tax, which is the post-750 discriminatory tax, was regressive, poorer Copts in Egypt were more likely to convert to Islam, holding Copts' religiosity, among other things, constant. And this, I argued, led to the shrinkage of Copts from 100% of the population into a better off minority, because the richer were more likely to survive. And this happened between 641, which is the date of the conquest, and 1200, and then the consequent gap between Muslims and non-Muslims, the socioeconomic gap, persisted because of group restrictions on apprenticeships and schooling. But historians debated whether the uniform tax on converts indeed increased in 750. So that's the first important historical debate. So we don't know really if this, or at least there is a debate if this reform in 750 actually took place. And some historians claim that this canonical Islamic tax system existed from the beginning of Islam. And second is why the 750 tax reform might have occurred. And more generally, we know little about how taxation and conversions were determined under the early Arab Caliphate. So what we do is this paper is that we use, so the paper has two legs, right? The first leg is the theoretical part. And what we try to do is to provide a simple theory of the optimal discriminatory and uniform tax mix and conversions from the viewpoint of the Arab Caliphate in both a static and a dynamic environment. So in this simple model, there are two groups, a favored group and an unwanted population. And the ruler imposes two taxes, a uniform tax on everyone and a discriminatory tax that is specific to the unwanted population. The novelty of this theory in comparison to normative taxation theory and in political economy literature is that what we have here is that the ruler might have negative weight on the welfare of the population. So the ruler actually wants the unwanted population to vanish, right? They want the tax base to vanish. And in normative taxation theory, they usually have positive weights or perhaps equal weights, but never negative weights. But even regardless of these affinity considerations, even if there are no negative weights, the ruler might simply have extrinsic motivation to increase the number of conversions to Islam, which essentially again lead to the same idea that they want the tax-paying population to decrease. So the direct consequence of that is that the discriminatory tax may be on the downward sloping side of the Laffer curve. So the Laffer curve is a simple and inverse U relationship between tax rate and revenues. And what this model shows is that the discriminatory tax would lie on the downward sloping part. So it's actually beyond the maximum, the tax revenue maximizing tax rate. Right? And we derive sufficient conditions for this to happen. Two important pieces of results, or the key important theoretical results in the paper, but there are many more in the paper actually. The first one is that more hostile or more religious tax authorities would increase both taxes. They would increase the uniform tax and the discriminatory tax. So the two taxes are complements rather than substitutes. And they would want to induce more conversions. But this result would hold if the optimal discriminatory tax is indeed on what we call the wrong side of the Laffer curve. Just a second. However, if the discriminatory tax lies on the upward sloping or the correct side of the Laffer curve, we would expect more religious tax authorities to increase the discriminatory tax and to induce more conversions, but they would reduce the uniform tax, right? So that's the key prediction in our model. The second prediction, so the first one is comparative static, right? This comes simply from the static model. The second one in which we use the dynamic model is that we try to suggest reasons for the increase in the uniform tax rate on converts, right? That happened in 750. And we suggest three exogenous changes in the exogenous parameters of the model, which are budgetary need increases, religiosity of rulers. For example, rulers could become more religious and then the same logic would apply, so they would increase the uniform tax. There could be that the uncertainty about Muslim Caliphate staying in power has declined over time, which would in fact lead to an increase in the uniform tax rate, because in the early period, if there is more uncertainty about Muslim rule, then the ruler could have higher discriminatory tax, right, leading to more conversions. And finally, even if there is no evolution of these exogenous parameters, and that's our favorite explanation, and we find support for that in the qualitative historical evidence, that if there is a threat of rebellion from the local populations against the Muslim rulers, then this threat of rebellion will go down simply because of conversions, because of the demographic changes in the population. So it's like a divide and rule policy, or gradualism, essentially, in imposing changes, right? So you internalize the local population, they become Muslim, and then after they become Muslim, you can now introduce an increase in tax rate. You had a question?
So I have two questions. The first one is, are we making an assumption that people couldn't leave the country?
Yes. So here's and this is supported by historical evidence. Copts were, which we focus on in this paper, were different from any other Christians, actually. They were considered a heretic group. So there was no place for them to go. Okay,
so that's actually crucial right here. So
Yes, because you can think about it that there are two responses. One is conversion and the other is migration. You could just flee the country. But I would think in the Middle Ages, even like Copts aside, which we know that out migration did not happen, migration from countries was less, I mean, even today it's not that big, right? So, yeah.
At that time, the boundary itself also is not as set.
True, true. So, anyways, I'm not going to argue about that, but it's yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the other point is related to this, because if you really, so I think this is something very crucial, because if you think people can really move around, and then the optimal solution from the pure economic perspective would be tax those people who are less mobile more.
Right.
So it sounds like they should discriminate Muslims rather than non-Muslims.
Yeah, so essentially here we're ruling out migration. That's, yeah, so you had.
From the standpoint of the ruler,
right.
You couldn't you say, okay, I'm going to increase the tax on this minority group, and I realize that that's going to eventually hurt my tax base because they're going to convert.
Yeah.
But I don't care.
Right.
You could have a very short-run attitude towards all of that, could you not? You could say, look, I need the money now.
Yeah.
And I realize I'm going to put a cost for that down. It's almost like running, let's say, deficits in the United States, right?
Yeah. So
you want money now, but not later on.
So, so I guess so in our model we basically have these two objectives, right? There is always this tension, this trade-off. I agree that maybe a ruler who's extremely religious might increase the discriminatory tax to a very high level just to wipe them out. This did not happen. So we're looking at maybe the intermediate regions. Empirically, what we do is, so we have these two main predictions, right?
Excuse me.
Yes.
In this period, how do you have any sense of the size of minorities? It's still pretty large.
The size of the minority. Yeah, so we know that in 1200, the best estimate I could get in my earlier paper is about 16%. 16, yes. So we don't know what happened exactly in between. I'm in favor of the very sharp decline, actually. I think, so what happened is that they declined below 50%, I would say, by 750. Based on the decline in tax revenues that I showed before, okay? Yeah. So what we do to test these predictions is that, or the first prediction, is that we exploit the variation within Egypt in the conversions and in the Pol and Karaj tax rates between 641 and 1200. So just to remind you, the Pol and Karaj tax rates, Pol tax rate is the post-750 discriminatory tax, and the Karaj tax rate after the increase or the tax reform that happened in 750, it became the uniform tax rate. So you can think of these as discriminatory and uniform tax rates. We have novel primary data sources. So for taxes, we have these individual level tax payments per person from tax papyri. So these are tax registers, right, that have individual names. Of course, there is a caveat here. These are papyri, so they are very few, right? What we get is 408 Pol tax payers and 464 Karaj tax payers in only 4 and respectively 7 out of 42 administrative units in Egypt. So we're talking about a very small n, essentially, very small variation, right? So our n is essentially 4 in the Pol tax and 7 in the Karaj tax. And even more, 95% come from only 2 kuras. 95% of the records come from exactly 2, right? The second outcome that we're interested in is conversions, and that we measure by a dummy variable that takes a value of 1 if a village had at least 1 Coptic church or monastery in 1200 from that we constructed from a Coptic medieval chronicle. The good thing about this measure is that it exists in all, we can observe it in all villages, in all 42 kuras. So the regressions on this one will be more convincing than this one. hopefully. Our main regressor is the religiosity of tax authorities, because this is where we can disentangle if indeed the discriminatory tax lied on the wrong side or the correct side of the Laffer curve, and whether there was this tension or not between conversions and tax revenues. We measure that by a dummy variable that equals 1 if there was Arab settlement in a Qura between 700 and 969. And the idea here is that Arabs settled where, so where Arabs settled, essentially they replaced the Coptic elites that were in charge of the tax administration. So the idea is that these areas would face more religious tax authorities at the extensive margin in comparison to Coptic elite-led or administered areas. We have controls for Copts' religiosity and income, which are important in the model, and we also use an instrumental variable for Arab settlement, which is the distance to the point of entry of the Arab army into Egypt. What do we find? In this, using this local level econometric evidence with all its caveats in mind, we find that taxpayers in the Quras where Arabs settled paid higher Pol and Karash taxes between 641 and 1100. Okay? I also must mention that we have additional evidence on the Karash tax from a later cadastre in 1375 that show exactly the same result. And this exists for all 42 Quras. Villages in these Quras were also less likely to have at least one Coptic church or monastery in 1200, which suggests that there were more conversions to Islam in the early period. So the evidence is consistent with the poll tax being beyond the tax revenue maximizing rate. We provide macro-level qualitative evidence to argue that the tax reform in 750 is indeed driven by the decline in uncertainty about Caliphate's rule and in the threat of rebellion due to conversions. So I think I have 10 minutes or, yeah. So just to give you a very quick overview of what we do. So on the theory side, there are two groups, favored group and the unwanted population. The unwanted population is characterized by a parameter theta, which is the willingness to pay to keep their identity. And this parameter is distributed according to a cumulative distribution function f of theta with an increasing monotone, with a monotone hazard rate. There are two taxes, uniform tax, which we call lambda, and say it's a tax on land. Here we assume that there is one unit of land, so there is no heterogeneity among taxpayers in land holdings. And then there is a discriminatory tax, which we denote by tau. So here we say the unwanted population members utility, we shouldn't call it minority really in the demographic sense, is basically if they give up their identity, they still have to pay the lambda, the uniform tax. But if they maintain their identity, they will keep the theta, but they will still have to pay both the lambda and the tau, right? The discriminatory and the uniform. And of course, what would follow is that they would maintain their identity if and only if theta exceeds a certain threshold, theta star, which is, in this case, is equal to tau. The revenue from the discriminatory tax would be given by tau, the tax rate, times the percentage of people who do not convert. Right? If we denote tau m as the revenue maximizing tax rate, then we say that the tax is on the wrong side of the Laffer curve if tau exceeds tau m, if the optimal tau star exceeding tau m. Ruler's objective function, the theory is more general, it's in the paper, but here I'm focusing on the lead example. So there are two parts of the objective function. The first part is what I was talking about in the beginning about the negative weights, the negative, there is this discrimination factor similar to, for those of you who know Becker's model on discrimination. So this is very, it's exactly the same idea. It's like taste for discrimination, essentially. And then there is this second part, which is could be psychological, or my favorite, I would call it incentive cost of per non-convert, right? So you could think of this second part as just the demographic conversions, that the ruler cares about having more people who convert to Islam. One thing also that I should mention is that here we're talking about conversions in the sense of changing religious affiliation. We don't care about beliefs, right? So the results would hold, I also must say that, even if we ignore the negative weights. Even if you only have this part, all the results of the model would still hold. There are basically there is a normalization that to have that the weights should be on average equal to 1. We define a more religious ruler in the Muslim sense such that essentially they assign lower weights to the unwanted population member, and they have a higher C. So they have a higher incentive cost, they suffer more essentially from having non-converts. The budget constraint is pretty simple. So we have a uniform land tax. Remember, there is a 1 unit of land, plus the tax revenue from the discriminatory tax should exceed some exogenously determined budget that they have to raise to the Caliphate. From this, we can solve for the optimal discriminatory tax rate, tau star. And basically, tau star would exceed tau m, which is given by this formula. So moving on to the empirics in the remaining 5 minutes, the main empirical predictions when on the wrong side of the Laffer curve is essentially the religiosity of tax authorities. So what we find is that the more religious tax rulers would want more people to convert to Islam, so they would increase the discriminatory tax. This would lead to more conversions, but at the same time, because they are operating on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, they have to complement for that by increasing the uniform tax on their own group. So this is a bit unintuitive, right? Because they tax more their favored group. This highlight in yellow means that the effect is negative, is reversed if you are on the correct side of the Laffer curve. Okay? So that's why we're focusing on this prediction in the empirics. The other ones, they are interesting and they are in the paper, but they don't change whether you are on the right or the correct or the wrong side of the Laffer curve. Okay, so let me skip that, I guess. So basically, in our local level econometric evidence, we run simple OLS regressions focusing on the effect of religiosity of tax authorities. We argue that the other factors in the model, such as the budgetary needs, uncertainty about Muslim rule, threat of rebellion, and if there is a cap or an upper bound on the uniform tax rates, that these determinants did not vary locally. And we have historical evidence on that. So we can, since we are focusing here on the local level evidence within Egypt, we are essentially controlling for things that vary locally, which are Copts' religiosity and Copts' marginal utility of income. We cluster standard errors at the Qura level, the level at which we observe Arab settlement. Of course, the problem that I mentioned from the outset is that we have extremely few clusters, 4 and 7 respectively. There is, as far as I know, there is no solution to this problem except increasing the sample size, and we cannot do that. What we do here is that we report alternative standard errors as well, but we don't oversell these results. These are suggestive results. We are aware of their caveats, but the papyri are the best source that we know of that give us data on this period. Arab settlement is potentially endogenous. We don't know exactly why Arabs settled in these areas, but it seems reasonable to use the distance to Arish, which is on the northeastern border of Egypt, the point of entry of the Arab army, as an IV. So the idea is that Arabs settled closer to the point of entry, and they were less likely to go south. This is a picture of the list of taxpayers in 703, 704. So you have names of people, you have the location of their fields. We don't use that, but we have the tax rates, the poll tax and the Karash tax. And this is from another source called the Arabic Papyrology Database. It's in Arabic, but it has the same information, but it's written, basically, the numbers. So I guess I have 1 minute, or yeah, okay. So I'm going to skip that. Here we're trying to argue that the distance to Arish is indeed exogenous. Just to show you the three tables, and then I'm going to stop. I think I will skip the macro level evidence. So here this table shows the determinants of the poll tax. I just want you to focus on the coefficient of the Arab settlement, right? So essentially what we find is that using this 408 individuals in these 4 kuras, that basically taxpayers paid more or a higher poll tax in kuras where Arabs settled. That's a pretty sizable number. This is the absolute tax in dinars per person. If you compare it to the mean dependent variable, which is about 1.14, right? The results still hold if we include everything, although in this case there is, of course, with having only 4 kuras, there is very high multi-collinearity problem, so we're not sure we want to do that. We also report the results for the IV, and it goes in the same direction. Determinants of the Karash tax, or the uniform tax. Again, we find that in areas where Arabs settled, there is a higher Karash payment per person compared again to the mean dependent variable. That's a very large amount. Here, if we include everything, because the problem here is even more severe, we lose the effect. If we use an IV, the effect is there. And then in this regression, we have all 42 kuras in all villages, 1,817 villages, and we get this negative coefficient on Arab settlement, which essentially says that where Arab settled, there were more conversions. This is consistent with our story. So I'm going to skip the macro level evidence. I don't have time for that, and let me leave this conclusion.
Well, let's thank Mohamed.
Thank you.